Hey, good afternoon, Tim. How are you today?
I'm doing fine, thank you. And you, Merv?
I'm doing well. I was just looking over your thoughts or our thoughts on today's subject matter being culture. And I suspect you meant organizational culture, but I suspect we together meant organizational culture. But as I was reviewing some thoughts about this, I was reminded years ago, I was working in Vancouver, British Columbia for a company there, and we were expanding quite rapidly. And for some reason, the labor force in Canada was a little sparse. I don't know what the deal was. So we ended up recruiting from the British Isles. We got people from Scotland and Wales and England and Ireland. And so you can imagine our Vancouver branch office with suddenly all of these accents. So I'm thinking culture, right? Culture, organization culture. We had to bring these people into our culture, assimilate them, because Britain and Canada really are quite different. I was reminded one day we were planning a team ski, just a ski afternoon, Grouse Mountain. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Vancouver, but Grouse Mountain is actually just kind of on the other side of Burrard Inlet in North Vancouver. So skiing is, you can ski and work and golf and swim the same day, which is just beautiful. And so one day we decided to do that and bring our newfound cousins from the British Isles with us. One young man, single guy, decided that he would brave the roads and he would give several of our young women off the project a ride up to the ski hill. And so as we're sitting there discussing logistics, he looked over at one of the women. He says, "So what time shall I come and knock you up in the morning?" So the place roared because clearly, culturally, and I'm not talking organizational cultural, but clearly culturally, that had a different meaning where he came from than what we were used to. So again, as we were discussing this whole topic of culture, that story came to mind. It just made me kind of chuckle and maybe thought it might be a good introduction for today's conversation. But so tell me, from your perspective, let's kind of give this an easy start. Just off the top of your head, what's a good working definition, do you think, of culture?
Oh, that's hard. Culture, we can talk about formal definitions, but I found culture to be sort of like the unwritten things that basically define a group. And you're right. When we say group, that's a complicated question in itself, because we have our family culture, we have our team culture, we have our organization culture, we have our corporate culture, we have our national culture, we have our religious culture, and all of them combined in to basically, it defines me as a part of this group and defines me a part of this group. And it can be food, it can be music, it can be art, could be perception of what's wrong or right. How's that for a definition?
I agree with you 100% that it's a complex, it's a complex definition. And I think you kind of nailed it. I guess I looked at it too, because some of what you were just saying, I think in my mind kind of boils down to shared values, perhaps, shared standards even. And I think you mentioned some religious aspects. There are shared beliefs, and those don't have to be religious. Those can be non-religious. Those can be just kind of the mores of the area, of the culture, of the organization. So yeah, I think that's a great definition. And I think if I were to expand on that, I think it's also closely related to one of your favorite topics, and that being corporate ethics. Say if we're talking about corporate culture, I think it relates to corporate ethics. I think corporations have an ethics that's defined by themselves. I think it's also defined in the corporate image that gets presented, sort of that public persona, that how they want to be seen out there. So we could probably define this to the nth degree and still not have a good definition.
Yeah, one of the ways that I actually bottomed out on understanding culture years ago was this really weird word called norms, When I went to college and studied human behavior and group behavior, they used the word norm, and I didn't know what it meant. But if you think of it as normal behavior, it sort of incorporates what you're talking about with that ethics. It's a defining statement that says this is wrong and that's right. And the norms are actually say, it's all right. It's all right to do this. It's not all right to do that. And you don't have to write it down. It just is something that is so a part of how you live. You don't think about it. Like water is to fish, like heat is to people who live in the desert, or like snow is to people who live in the Arctic. It's just part of the way you do things. You don't have bare feet when you walk outside. That's a norm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's again, it's one of these things that we all think we know about until we start to try to define them. And I don't think it's important that you and I get to a firm definition, but we have the conversation so we agree
Yeah.
to an extent what the what the landscape of what culture means.
But think about it this way too. I've worked, well, I've worked in IT for many, many years, but my entire corporate career has been in IT as a provider. But even at that, as I provided services, I did come across different sort of, if I could do sort of stereotypical forms of culture. For example, I did a lot of work with governments, and they tended to be what I would describe probably traditional corporate culture. There's a hierarchy. There are very specific defined roles and responsibilities. There's a stability, there's a risk aversion. And so you kind of, when you're dealing with that, especially as an IT provider, you kind of change your way. Maybe if you're the aggressive provider, maybe you have to kind of tame that down, that sort of thing. At the same time, I've worked with probably some companies that might be defined best as kind of a stereotypical Silicon Valley type, where they're very aggressive, very innovative. I'll call them an innovative culture, and not risk averse at all. I mean, they take risks and they reward risks, and sometimes they lay it all on the line. And then there are those, I think, that are market-based cultures. So I think of a company like a real estate company, or a retail company, or maybe an auto dealership, where basically you're driven by profitability and you're only as good as the next sale kind of thing. So that has a whole different thought process around how that culture gets formed. And then there's the ones that probably I'm also familiar with, having worked with nonprofits. They tend to be kind of a family oriented or a clan type of culture, where the individual is paramount. And that, so I think even within corporate cultures, we can kind of distinguish different types of behaviors within those. And then we as project managers, when we go into those cultures, we need to also modify our behavior to match those situations. I don't know if that makes sense, or if that is something you've come across.
Oh, all the time. Let me give you an example that I love to give my students. So I was in marketing in a Fortune 50 for quite a few years, and I was rolling out new products. And I was doing a marketing campaign down in South America from the United States, and I was working with my peer down there. And I was saying, okay, we need to get a contract in place. Now, I knew already that if you do a contract with South America, the Mercador trading bloc, they require that you have 3 copies of contract in the buyer's language, in the seller's language, and in Portuguese. And I said, do you know anybody that can translate the contract? Because I knew pretty much that he was not allowed to do that because he was going to be the buyer. And he said, oh, yeah, my cousin works for the government. If you just slip him $500, he'll push it through. I'm thinking, okay, what are we going to do? Luckily, I failed forward. Okay. I said, okay, let me do a little research. And usually I would make the decision right there, but this is when I was starting to become wise. And I went to my attorneys, and the attorneys inside the corporation said, "Thank you, Tim. We've been looking for this guy for 5 years." It seems that there is a government authorized person who is allowed to do the translation, and there's only about two per nation down there. And I had just stumbled across this person, and I've solved that problem the attorneys had been working on for years. And it was like, I thought I was going to be having an ethics discussion and writing this up and trying to figure out the impact to my product. And here I am is helping the whole corporation move forward. And so it was like, what we consider bad and our perceptions of what we consider bad, we really need to not necessarily keep an open mind, but understand that if we capture all the details, it might not be as we perceive. And that was the best education to how to approach culture, whether it's national, group, or organizational in any environment.
Interesting. I had a similar situation with a Caribbean client, um, but theirs was a little less ethical. Fortunately, we were able to skirt that because we had the company I worked for at that time was very, very disciplined in terms of its ethics, and we were able to satisfy the contract without having to do anything that was untoward or that might give us a black eye at some point. But I will say this about that culture. One thing I really enjoyed that I had to get used to, we would be called into, say, with major sponsor, let's say a meeting with a major sponsor to provide status or to get some ideas to how to move forward with the project. And it was always interesting to me here in America, that the 1 o'clock we start the meeting, 1:01 we're already into business. Not in that culture. In that culture, we spent the first 10, 15 minutes, someone would bring in some very strong espresso coffee with some wonderful little cookies, and we'd share what happened during the day or what happened on the weekend. And about 1:14, 1:15, we'd get into the meeting itself. And then it was all business. But what an interesting way to kind of bring people into a meeting, bring people into the culture of that organization, and just sort of be civilized about how we approach problems, statuses. And you know what? In the next 45 minutes, we got as much done as we ever did on the mainland anyway. So
That's correct. That's
it's,
correct. If you understand the culture and if you can work within that culture without bending your personal or organizational ethics, there's a lot of benefits. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You're not going to be fighting the flow of the river, however you want to put it. I was working with a big box distributor out of Michigan, and New Mexico is a wonderful place to live. It's like mañana, right? And mañana does not mean tomorrow. And I am here for so long. I've been here for over 30 years that it's like that's part of who I am. It's part of, my definition of Tim. It's, slow down, take a breath and think. Where in Michigan, which is more towards a corporate culture, is like New York. Fast, 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 go, go, go. Go, 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 fast, 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 go, go, go. And then at the end of the day, we collapse and we relax. And it was fascinating to see that neither one was good nor bad. It was how people implemented and got good work done through their corporate framework, which fascinated me. And if you can actually open this up to your teams, and I've explored this, having multiple cultures not only gives us these opportunities for different styles of work for different needs, but it gives us different perceptions and different ways of looking at problems. It's like you have a person that's coming from here, you have a person that's coming from here. And if you can get people to understand that multiple cultures has benefits, even though it's hard to assimilate, that's where innovation happens.
it's huge. And now that I think about it, we've kind of covered, I think you said South America, then kind of the East Coast, our favorite state of New Mexico, my experiences in Canada with British people. You and I both worked with Eastern Asian practitioners. So thinking about all of those cultural experiences that we have, do you think there's a marked difference between, let's say, organizational cultures and the general culture? I mean, we're talking about kind of a melting pot of cultures, but at the same time, we do exist in a culture, both in our kind of area that we live, plus our organization. Do you think there's a connection there?
I think so. I think so. I'm not going to defend it. So let's call it an opinion. I think we can agree that we have a working definition of culture in general.
Yeah.
Okay. I think also we can agree that there are different levels and different quote unquote types of culture. I believe that culture is there for a reason or an objective. If you think about us in prehistory, in Paleolithic times, right? Culture is there to bind the group. It creates that, that bonding that says we are going to survive. That's the primary objective. As a group, we're going to take care of each other. And when we can't take care of ourselves, others take care of us so we can do the same in turn in the future. As we get into a more complicated societal structure, whether it's into a project team, whether it's into an organization or a business unit or corporation or a nation, all of a sudden the objectives change. I think the concept of culture stays the same, but I think the objectives shape the culture. And that's best I can do to actually create some continuity, but allow for that differentiation.
Yeah, I agree. And I was going back, you and I have talked even on these podcasts as well as over coffee about sort of my upbringing on a farm in Canada. And I remember as I was preparing for this particular podcast, I remember thinking back to those days where, we didn't have necessarily the Amish tradition where everyone went and raised everyone else's barn or that sort of thing, but there was definitely an understanding that people helped people. So when my Uncle Joe's combine broke down, we figured out a way to get other combines onto his field to harvest his grain so that his grain wouldn't sit out. So it was very much a culture that worked together, collaborative, hardworking, responsibility, that sort of thing. But that also generated itself in the towns itself. We were about 20,000 people in the area that we lived. But if you went to the dry cleaners or the grocery store, or every small town had a co-op store, very cooperative, right? A cooperative store. If you went that culture, that farming culture was part of how they did business as a dry cleaner, as a baker, as a grocery store, or whatever. Now, when I left the farm and went to college and then got my first job in the big city, I was not prepared for the different culture in the office than I was used to at home. At home, everybody knew about everybody's business and they looked out for each other. In the office, things were much more private. You didn't share a lot of things. And so I had to get used to that new culture.
So this leads me down to game theory. Okay. I'm really big into economics and playing games because humans get things done by playing games. Traditional culture is there with one objective in mind. How can we keep the game going? And we see this in corporations too. When you have a really young corporation, its one objective is to survive. And if it can make that 5-year benchmark, yay, we made it. Can we make it to 10? Yay, we can. And all of a sudden, there's this subtle transition when it goes from 10 to 20 years. Survival is not the primary motive. The game changes. The game changes from can we keep the game going to can I win or do I have to lose? And the problem is when you play the game of win-lose, somebody has to win and somebody has to lose. There's different rules you have to play, right? And win-lose sets up a loser as well as a winner. In most corporations today, it's understood there's a finite bucket of promotions and raises. So every year when you're going into your performance review, you're playing win versus lose. You know, if your family's happy and you get a vacation, somebody else is really going to be unhappy. And we have to understand whether we own our corporations or we run our corporations, or whether we actually work within our corporations, that these two games are in constant competition. Now, I'm not just talking about corporations. This setup of games happens in politics, in religion, in every aspect of society. It's fascinating that we gravitate towards one or the other. And that's just part of our culture.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, if I go back to sort of how I defined 3 or 4 different types of cultures, that family-oriented culture, perhaps there wasn't as much gamesmanship there because everyone looked out for each other. But I have had the opportunity, I would say privilege, of working for those market-oriented ones as IT providers, where it literally was, as you said, promotion time was, it wasn't winner take all, but there was definitely an up or out situation. You either moved up or you moved out. And I
Yeah.
remember, was it Jack Welch that sort of rated people as A, Bs, and Cs, and every year the Cs would, the bottom 10% or something would be moved out into other areas. And
Yeah.
when I thought about that, I thought, well, eventually, if Jack Welch keeps on that sort of theory and building people up, eventually he himself will drop into the C category and have to remove himself.
Well,
But I don't
that's
think
the and that's what Jack's model said. It created it. He used the word coopetition. I don't think that he created that concept, but he embraced competition because it forced growth. But at the same time, he knew that people had to work together, and that was his bridge from beyond zero sum game, which is the win versus lose, to over to the non-zero sum, which is keep the game going as long as you can.
yeah.
It's a struggle. It really is. It's funny how we actually define these games and define the rules, and we think we make the rules as we go along. You see this in your teams, right? The first thing you do in a project team, you build the team charter, you put the ground rules in place, and here's the discipline around how we're going to treat each other and how we're going to work together. But as a project manager, you set this up, and then the team starts pushing the boundaries. And all of a sudden, you have the group itself emerge, and the group and the project manager have this push-pull because the group needs the boundaries to be a little different than the project manager wants. And the project manager needs those boundaries to be a little different than the group wants. And there has to be some meeting of the minds. And in complex organizational and group structures, in large projects, we see this all the time.
We do. And I think the way that I've seen it, and I've seen it evolve, is a lot of times, as you mentioned, when we set up our charter and we set up the roles and responsibilities, including, by the way, the client personnel that is lent to us for the duration of the project. So as we go through that, the project manager and his or her leads, they tend to set up that generic structure. But in my experience, because every client situation is different, every project situation is different, that pushing of the boundaries actually was useful. And what I did as a project manager, what my colleagues did as project managers, was they allowed that pushing to happen. Now, you still operated within the sphere of the overall vision, and the project manager had the right to kind of rein people in. But at the same time, you didn't want to destroy or lose some of that innovation that helped the project progress quickly. And so as long as we were able to listen to some of our developers and some of those people who were on the front lines doing the actual work, and take that into consideration and allow them to have their way because they found the way to make things better, our projects were better. So yeah, our culture grew as well within the vision, but it still grew according to the way the team structure wanted it. So I thought that worked very well for us.
You know, that's funny because one of my favorite managers explained it this way. He said, Tim, the best you can do as a manager is create a crucible. A crucible is where you heat up metal. And sometimes it's heat, sometimes it's pressure, and sometimes it's both. And you have basically the workers and the manager. And it's the pressure between those things that creates the steel and the diamonds. And he got really excited when he would ever talk about this with me. He said, that's where you want to play, Tim, with the pressure and the heat. You have to manage it carefully because you don't break people. But what you want to do is create a little pressure and a little heat so that you can actually manage and control the creation of the steel or the diamonds. This is somebody who I consider very artful in the management of culture.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And thinking, have you ever been in a situation like that where you either as a manager or as a person who was being managed were in a situation where there was that push and pull and perhaps it didn't turn out as good as
Oh
you
yeah.
expected?
Yeah, and that leads me to a whole perspective where I was taught by a mentor who said, you know what, you have a little project over here, and this project is like a petri dish. It's a little experiment, and it's established culture by itself, and you have an opportunity to actually work and learn at how cultures grow and mature. Well, I was learning how to do this. And what's really weird was the organization had some needs. They had some needs for formal documentation. And the problem was the project was clearly an unknown objective. The work was well defined, but nobody knew where it was going, and it was declared by some vice president who said you need to do research here, and there was no clear expectation of why. So the culture was around, we got to get this work done and we're supporting the organization. So the culture of the team became very divisive because there were people who were aligned with the vision of the vice president, and there were groups within the team who were aligned more with the organization that was looking at this as a boondoggle. And so my handling of that was immature too. On top of that, so we got the work done, and the vice president was sort of happy. The organization was frustrated because, they couldn't just hand the problem over to me to manage. The objective of the organization was give this problem to Tim and he'll figure it out, right? And it because culture is not discussed and it's understood, this was a very difficult thing. One of the things I learned from that experience is even though culture is understood, it still needs to be communicated and discussed, and it needs to be explored as a source of risk and issues.
Well, maybe that's why we had trouble defining it in precise terms when we started this conversation, is because it's something that you can't write down and put into a rule book, right? It's something that is unwritten. I think you mentioned before, it's something that sometimes evolves. As you were speaking there, and I was thinking, the song "I Fought the Law and the Law Won" came to my mind. It's kind of like I fought the culture and the culture won.
Oh, it will every time. When and it's because of the soft and hard wiring of people. It's the programs we run inside our heads that are conscious and unconscious, but it's also the chemistry we have. Our very chemistry that makes us up actually drives us to belong to a group and and needs to belong to a group. And so when we go against culture, no wonder some of us have health issues and have emotional issues. It's a struggle. And when we have a paradigm shift in culture, for instance, pandemic, right, is a good example. When we have such an abrupt change in culture from we want you to come into work every day, be here 8 to 5, to all of a sudden work from home. We need you to figure out and tell us the best way to work from home. This is what we call cognitive dissonance. We're having a conversation inside of our head, and it's like, what's real here is not what's going on in here. And it's like we have multiple languages trying to figure out a problem. And we can understand why for the last 15 or 16 months we've had incredible struggles.
We do, and from my perspective, being an IT provider, we would bring teams in from all over the country, sometimes in some cases from halfway across the world, and so when now we're remote, people are also on different time zones, and so you're having to manage that time zone difference as well to get people at their best in meetings or in whiteboard sessions or whatever it takes. So in my own experience, I'm very much a conformist. So I've been able to, whatever situation I've been in, even as an independent, my last 16, 17 years, I've been able to conform to the culture that I was in. But there was a couple times I can honestly say that I remember one situation was sort of a laissez-faire culture and a little bit of shoot from the hip, a little bit of we're in the Wild West culture. And that culture was attempted to be tamed by the Eastern button-down corporate people.
Mhm.
And it was such a situation that was one of those situations where I fought the culture and the culture won. And for my best interest, I just said, I love this place, but I'm going to move on. And I think at some point we have to make those decisions as well, even though we're project managers or managers at some level. At some point, our psyche and our health is much more important than any kind of loyalty to any single corporation or culture within that corporation.
And that's a great call to action and a reminder of how important ethics and morals are to understanding not just culture, but your response to culture. There are times to walk away. And again, understanding culture and the role of culture, and consciously, even if it's inside your head, addressing it, may not get rid of the issues and the problems and the dilemmas we have, but at least it allows us to consciously determine how we can work, interact, or respond to it.
Oh, absolutely. And I was interested too. I know that you teach some classes through project management organizations. I was just wondering, how do you deal with this with your students, for example, new managers, or what kinds of questions might they have of you when they're discussing these sorts of? I'm sure culture comes up in your discussions.
Well, it's really funny. So we already touched on one of these. One of the big questions is what happens when my project culture needs to be different from organizational culture? And that's a common thing. You know, I, Tim, you speak a good story here. And I love the way you actually propose projects, but it's not going to work inside my organization. And that's a common theme. Yes. And the way I address this to my students is I give an aspirational viewpoint. There's rocks and there's water, and rocks are going to tell water how to flow, and water is going to slowly shape the rocks so that water can go the way it does. And this is how culture changes. But obviously, like you said, a lot of it is acquiescence, which I say is behaving like water and working around water instead of around the rocks instead of through it. There's another part of this that comes up a lot, and it's the unspoken things. Like I speak to a lot of people from East Asia. And when you are a professor, when you profess, or when you teach, you are the expert. You are truth. You are the embodiment of truth. Truth walks in the door, puts down the books, and says, this is the way it is. Problem is, leadership at its best says, I'm not the expert. Yeah, I brought you guys together here. The strength is having different opinions, and this is a very Western way to lead. And to throw people into a dilemma like this is to create this whole bodily, it's almost an existential crisis with these students because they're saying this guy is not an expert because he's not saying, this is the truth. I'm saying, no, I'm not the truth. You want to put me up on the pedestal? Don't put me there, put truth. And you and I will discuss what truth is, and you and I will agree on the tools that we use, like debate, like argument, like conflict management. And we'll use these things to find the truth together. And it's funny because both cultures, Eastern Asia as well as Western civilization, have these stories and myths about leaders who were not leaders. The janitor who sits down and has a cup of coffee with the CEO, and the CEO respects the way the janitor looks at life so much. He needs input from the janitor to make decisions. And we know these wise people who act almost like they're unwise, but still are needed as those pivotal sources of common sense and truth that do not really fit in with our model of how culture works. And this is where the dilemma occurs. We can't get rid of this because, again, this is human nature. Look at the Southwest United States. A lot of them have in their culture a designated person in a tribe who's the crazy maker. And everybody says that person is crazy. But because they're crazy, they have context. It's like coyotes and wolves do the same thing. You have alphas and betas, but you also have the Zs or the Zs who are the runts. And it's almost like they're the jesters of the coyote or the wolf tribe, and humans do the same thing. They are there for a purpose and a reason, and we have to understand this. I really think that we have much to learn from how groups behave, and we're just touching the top of the iceberg of this. And when I introduce this to people who have been doing projects for 5 or 10 years, this is like, Tim, you're the crazy one. I can't even put, and they tell me, how am I to put this in context, much less try this out in my organization?
Well, I think so much of that too. You and I are old enough to remember when we were always a Western civilization, very little influence from Eastern Asia or from Europe. And so therefore our culture developed, and I suspect all the way back to, when Ford did the assembly line, to when Watson did the manufacture of the first computers, to all of those sorts of things that grew up as Western culture. I think you and I are in that situation where we came from that, and then we're influenced very much by Eastern Asians, by the British Isles, by Eastern Europeans. I've worked with Eastern Europeans as well. I've worked with people from Israel and some from Arabia, and it just, the differences that come, and then suddenly you have to change your way of thinking, because when it really comes down to people are people are people. I
Yeah.
mean, and so people do things differently, but when you can come together culturally and for a common cause, what an incredible mixing of various experiences that make that project or that vision go much better and much stronger.
Yeah, there's a certain nation in Western Europe. which has very precise engineering. And when you ask them a question, they actually solve the problem with you so that you understand every single step. And I love working with them. I had like 2 or 3 teams out there, right? And then I had another team that was out near the Mediterranean who did software engineering. And what they would do is they say, and they think about it in their heads and they say, here you go.
Yeah.
Here's the solution. And it's like, wait, you guys are totally different. And they could almost give me identical solutions, except it's just the way they solve problems. And it's almost like I would love to get groups of people in the same room and see how they interact. This is the beautiful thing. Culture actually is an expression of a group. It's not the expression of the people. And oftentimes culture, even though it does different things, gets to the same objective.
This, I was thinking as you were saying that, one of the Eastern Asian cultures that I've worked with a lot, very hardworking, just brilliant people. But I had this against them, and it was just, I really disliked them for this one thing. They ate dinner at 9 o'clock at night.
Mm.
and I wanted to so much be with them because they would order the best food there was.
Oh,
But
yeah.
9 o'clock at night, I wanted to be at home with my family. So that one thing I held against them, but I still love working with that particular culture and the other ones from Eastern Asia. Love, love, love what they bring to the table.
Yeah, yeah. I have a question on this. I've been talking about this a lot, that culture is an expression of the group and it's not created. And I even brought this up earlier too, where the leader, a project manager especially, can actually establish parts of the culture early through the team charter and the and through the ground rules. But again, I read this from real experts in business field and leadership, and it says the leader owns and established culture. What do you think about that statement?
I don't know that I agree. Based on my experience, my working experience as an IT provider to various types of organizations, I don't know that I go along. As a leader, I have created let me put it this way, I created the circle within which my team is allowed to work. And I don't, allowed is a strong word, in which my team works. So that circle is my sovereignty. But whatever happens within that circle, as long as it stays within that circle, it's fine. And that circle gives lots of leverage as far as I'm concerned, because it's the team that's on the ground that's seeing the problems firsthand. I'm not there understanding what happened in a requirements definition situation that may have changed part of my contract. I'm not there. So I have to allow them to have some latitude, bring it to me, or make some decisions on their own. And there's always some give and take, but I don't know that the leader is the creator or even the owner of the culture. I think the leader is wise to let the team evolve that culture and then work within that culture with the team and sort of evolve together. Right?
How about this for a model? How about this for a model, Merv? What if we're looking at it as using a hang glider to get from a cliff down to the beach, okay? And culture is the wind, and where the leader actually teaches the team how to use the hang glider and use the hang glider to explore the wind and use the wind to get the best way to get down safely. And so the leader doesn't control the wind per se, but the leader understands how to read the wind and wind currents and prepare the people using the hang glider for success. How does that feel for you?
I like it as long as that target on the beach is the one that gets hit. You can't sort of overshoot it by 50 yards or undershoot it by 50 yards.
Exactly.
Well, undershooting is maybe not as bad as overshooting. Right.
So it's an objective focused concept there. And I agree with you. That's one thing that has to occur. The project manager owns the vision and owns the objective, and that cannot be denied.
Yeah.
From where culture standpoints, I believe it's the weather and it's the environment, and it's an environmental factor. We can't control it, and yet we still have to build it into the project. And so therefore we have to treat it just like we do weather. Do we need coats? Do we need jackets and a hat? Or do we need shorts and sandals?
Yeah.
Based on those needs, what gets the job done, what gets us down to that beach where we need to go as safely as possible.
Well, now, and if you think about it from another perspective, let's say we win a project and we end up fielding the entire team with Caucasian Americans as one example. And let's say we could exist in a parallel universe and put that exact same project together with Caucasian Americans, Caucasian Europeans, Eastern Asians, African Americans, Native Americans, just a huge melting pot of different cultures. I think the two project cultures would end up being different, but I think as long as the leader can work within those two realms, we can bring both teams to the same conclusion and end up with a successful project. But you're going to have different working patterns within those two situations I just described.
Yeah, and the one thing that I would say is the more culture you add, the more diverse cultures you have, the more opportunity for innovation. But again, the more opportunity for conflict you're going to have too.
Yeah, that's
Human, yeah,
yeah.
that's as long as you accept the disadvantages, you have those advantages.
Although I've seen a lot of conflict with heterogeneous teams as well. So,
oh yeah,
it's just, it comes around. But yeah, I think from that perspective, you and I can both agree on the fact that the leader can set the boundaries, but I think the leader needs to have his team or her team establish that culture and go along with that as well.
Yeah, I have another question for you, and I think this can be fun to talk about. Do you have any tips or tricks to explore the culture so you understand these unwritten things? Have you ever started to think how you understand the culture of an organization?
Yeah, and I think I came about this organically. I don't think I really thought through this. But again, as an IT provider that goes into organizations to solve their problem with an IT solution, I've had the opportunity in 20 different states to work with 25, 30 different organizations. And when I think of each one of those, so yes, I'm not part of that organization, but when I bring my team in, we become part of that organization for that finite time period. And for a lot of what we end up doing, right, from requirements gathering through user acceptance testing, is evolving with that project culture with the team that we're working with from the client side. So a lot of things I'll say, can you describe your organization in a couple dozen words? And if I get 5 or 6 people giving the same description, I know I've hit something. If I get 5 or 6 people giving different types of descriptions, I may ask further questions like, so around here, what's really important? Or how does somebody here get promoted? What's it take to, who fits in and who doesn't fit in your organization? And pretty soon you begin to understand the undercurrents and unwritten rules and mores of that organization just by asking a few questions over a cup of coffee, in a lapse during a requirements gathering, something, but just ask some questions and have a conversation. And it's amazing what will come out of those people who are being totally honest with you.
Yeah, if you can get them to get their guard down, if you can get them to be authentic and relaxed and share information, that's beautiful. There's a couple ways I figured it out. Like you, get them in an informal discussion and asking open-ended questions like you did. One of my favorite open-ended questions is, how do you guys argue here? Do you have a
Mm,
formal structure that HR says, here's how you're going to get along and solve problems? Or do you just sort of on your own to figure it out? Another way I look at it is go to the place people are more social, like the cafeteria, like the coffee break room. And one of my mentors, he was actually brought in as a formal trainer, and he'd been working at one of the big 8 consulting firms for like 18 or 19 years. And he said one of the best things you can do when you're starting a new job or you're a consultant is go to the break room and look at the bulletin board and see what they put up on the bulletin board. Is it all formal? Is it some informal? Do they have, here's our product life cycle? And what does that product life cycle look like? Here's how we make decisions. Here's our org chart. And how dense is the org chart? How many levels? And it gets really fascinating. This is like an archaeological study, a cultural anthropological study of the corporation. The other place that I found is over food. Like
yes.
you said, food is a good indicator of culture. And where do you want to eat tonight? Do we need to consider vegetarian, non-veg? Do we need to consider meat, non-meat? Do we eat family style? Do we have curries? Do we just do it on ourselves? Do we eat from our rooms? How does it function? And it doesn't matter how it works. What matters is that, you as a leader understand what the normal behavior for these people are. Like you said, do we eat at 9 p.m.?
Yeah.
It's shocking, but that's normal for some people. And to understand that's normal for some people allows us to push our boundaries out a little further.
And by the way, their food was so good that I took every chance I could at that 9 o'clock dinner. So
Oh, I'm with you. I'm with you. The celebration around food is such it creates such camaraderie.
think,
People are proud of what they eat. They're
yep.
proud of how it's displayed, and to appreciate the food that's brought to you is a gift to the people who brought it, and it's just a wonderful celebration.
And you know what's interesting? I think you brought it out in terms of that it's a great thing to be around food and around that camaraderie. You know what else I found is that it's almost like the Las Vegas motto. What happens in the project stays in the project. There's a loyalty that gets developed that even now, some of my teams that I left 20 years ago, I still will not divulge things that happened on that project other than perhaps some generic terms as a lesson learned. But because I feel so loyal to that group and the bond that we formed and the culture that we created, that even today I will not divulge some of the conversations that we had during that time.
You feel such a loyalty. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
I measured this by a key performance indicator called the project team tattoo. If you could perceive your team not getting a tattoo, but just having a discussion over dinner, what would a team tattoo look like if we were to get one? You have a strong, healthy culture. Somebody who actually supports not just my personal needs and expectations, but supports what we're doing. And I may disagree with you totally, but I'll support you to the end of the earth. When you have that type of appreciation of the group, you have a healthy culture.
Oh, huge. So do you think as project managers, we've got a few minutes left here, but do you think as project managers that we have a chance? I mean, we're a microcosm within an organization solving a problem with IT. But do you think as project managers have the opportunity or even the ability to influence the culture of the organization?
You've got me thinking. Before this meeting today, I would have said yes. Now, that allegory that I had of the hang glider in the wind, I'm wondering if culture is more of the wind, and what we as project managers can do is help people steer successfully through that wind. And I think we may not be able to influence the culture per se, but we can successfully guide and support the group, basically creating an environment so the group can do the work well in spite of any culture that's in. How does that sound?
I like that. See, from my own experience, again, this is so repetitive. I was an IT provider all my time. You go in,
Mhm.
you do the project, you leave. And so you're there for 2 years, 3 years. The longest I had was 6 years. But as a project manager or as a manager within the project management organization, I could influence the immediate culture around me, I personally, or through our project, because naturally our IT projects would often require some organizational change as well. And so often with organizational change comes some sort of cultural change. But again, it was a very narrow influence. But here's what often did happen. The client staff that was lent to us for the duration of the project began to like what we did. So we were so different in the way we approached work than where they came from. Neither right or wrong. They just happen to like the way that we progressed things quickly, logically, expeditiously, that suddenly we ended up inundated with applications for jobs with us. So maybe we didn't influence the organization, but we sure hired a lot of incredible subject matter experts for projects that followed on in other organizations that were similar in style and look at. So
I had a similar experience. We were brought in to solve problems. It was always a vice president or an executive. An executive has a problem that needs to be solved, and what's your solution? That's the business you are in too. Whether it was working with the Federal Drug Administration, whether it was working inside the corporation, and they have to influence the entire corporation to take their data from small network attached storage underneath their desk and put it in a data center 3 states away. And a lot of our projects, even though they were short, 6 or 7 months or 2 years, we were changing the culture hugely. And so we had to understand, number one, that we were doing this and respect that. And number two, we had to do it in such a way that everybody said that it is necessary for us to change the very way we do our work, which is changing our culture. And this was the one of the reasons why we were respected and brought into so much of our work was that we came in with the understanding of that we are doing a business transformation, but we are also doing a cultural transformation.
I still, I still remember, kind of further on to what you were just saying. I still remember a project where we would have these stand-up sessions in the morning quite often, 15 minutes, go, right? And then at the end of the day at 4 o'clock, we would have a sit down and just kind of go over the events of the day and prepare. And I remember one of the first couple of times when we went past the 4:15 mark in the evening, in the late afternoon, my client representatives began to get up and leave. No, no, howdy do, nothing. They just got up and left because in their culture, they ended their day at 4:15. And the fact that we wanted to carry on much longer didn't matter. We could carry on as we wanted. So when I was thinking about that, several months later, those same people, I still remember this, we'd be leaving the project site after getting our day, say at 7 or 8 o'clock at night, we'd be leaving the project site. And these are the day when they had less equipment on projects than we do today. I remember those same staff coming to us and saying, can we use your printer this evening? We're going to be here working on our training manuals probably till 9 or 10 o'clock at night.
Oh,
So
wow.
yeah, I think we have the ability to shift culture with those who are in our immediate proximity. And we need to do that for the betterment of the project and the betterment of the individual, not to take advantage of people, never, but to always better the project and what we're there for as project managers.
Very well said. Very well said.
Well, I think we're winding up. Tim, where can we find you?
I'm still over at LinkedIn. That's my primary conversation starter. I'm the Tim Jerome, who's in project management and a PMP trainer and a project manager trainer and a thought leader. Link to me. I am cleaning up my LinkedIn. I'll get through it. I have had a huge inundation of students here lately, so be patient with me, and I'll treat you guys to a lot of interesting stories. Otherwise, I'm here with you. And you, Merv?
I'm also on LinkedIn. In fact, I was a little concerned that I got thrown off LinkedIn the other day. Apparently, the entire worldwide LinkedIn went down. So,
Wow.
but I'm Merv Jersak, and you can find me on LinkedIn also as People First Project Management. I have a business page on LinkedIn, and then I also have a website by the same name, peoplefirstprojectmanagement.com. So if anyone has any questions, any thoughts, any kind of ways of wanting to get hold of us, that's how you can right now. And we'd be happy to engage you in conversation and to keep this conversation going.
Yeah, and we have links to recordings of our previous conversations too. And hopefully that if you don't see us sending that out, or you don't have that going out as a channel, reach out to us, and we'll make sure that you have access not just to our ongoing conversations, but the previous ones as well.
Absolutely. All right. Until next time, we will see you next time, same place, same time, and with a different, interesting project management topic. Until next time, Tim.
Thanks again, Merv, and thanks everyone.